All right, so we're currently working our way through the New Testament, which has a total of 27 books, which we've already mentioned the 4 Gospels, Luke, Acts, and also threw in Thomas in there for funsies. Okay, so in this portion, we're going to check out the next 21 books that are known as the Epistles. Epistle just simply means letter. So most of these books have been attributed at some point to the Apostle Paul, and they're therefore known as the Pauline epistles, okay? And the other 7 are attributed to early Christian leaders and are known as the general or Catholic epistles, Catholic simply meaning wide-ranging or universal. We can split up the Paulines into 3 categories: 9 letters written to specific churches, and the next 4 written to individuals, okay? Which leaves Hebrews, which is pretty much universally recognized as having not been written by Paul. All right, so when looking at the 9 letters that are written by Paul to specific churches, notice that all 9 of these letters start with the exact same word, Paul, which is a little interesting to us nowadays because our letters usually start as like dear so-and-so, but the New Testament epistles kick off with the sender's name first, then the recipient's name, and then some sort of personal greeting. So Paul writes some of his letters, his name, their name, what's up, and then they get sent off, okay? Romans went to Rome. The 1st and 2nd Corinthians went to Corinth. Galatians was sent to Galatia, which is actually the only one that's not a city. Galatia is an entire region, okay, in the middle of Anatolia, which is today modern Turkey. Ephesians goes to Ephesus, which is also on the coast of Anatolia. Okay, then Philippians goes to Philippi, which is a city in ancient Macedonia named after Alexander the Great's father, Philip. Colossians was sent to Colossae, another city in Anatolia. Finally, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are set to Thessaloniki in the same region as Philippi. Okay, so the first big question, did Paul write these letters? Now, we've already seen plenty of examples whereby a person is claimed by a text or by tradition to have been written by an author they didn't personally write. Like most modern scholars believe that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and Solomon didn't even write the Song of Songs, and Matthew probably didn't even write Matthew. But as an interesting surprise to even most scholars and even the most secular scholars is that Paul did in fact write most of these letters. There is some disagreement or Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, but Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and 1st Thessalonians are all pretty much universally recognized as having been the genuine works of Paul the Apostle. Now, a good question would be, how do scholars actually make these kind of considerations? Well, it mostly comes down to style. Okay? The 6 epistles thought to be genuinely all share a very similar vocabulary style, grammar, and similar ideas. The other 3 stand out as being different. Now, Paul could have just had an assistant write out those letters. He could have wrote them at a different date. Maybe his grammar had evolved by then, or he could have just simply been in a different mood. Scholars are divided on this, but for those who are more unsure, these 3 are actually considered pseudopigrapha, meaning that they were very likely written several decades after Paul's death by someone pretending to be Paul or wanting to represent a view they believe Paul would have. We've seen over and over in previous broadcasts how it wasn't uncommon for in ancient times for writers to do that. It was definitely a writing style back then. Now, as I mentioned before, Paul lived up to around 60s CE, and when he was executed by Nero. So the genuine epistles of Paul can be placed around the time of his ministry, considering he actually wrote them. Galatians and 1st Thessalonians are believed to have been the earliest letters, somewhere around 50 CE, with Romans and 2nd Corinthians written somewhere around the late 50s, and Philip showing up last, usually being put in somewhere around the 60s. The other letters, if they are pseudopigrapha, likely around the end of the 1st century or probably even early into the 2nd century. Meaning Galatians and 1st Thessalonians are the 2 earliest books in the entire New Testament. And all genuine Pauline epistles were all written before the 4 Gospels. A lot of people don't know that. Do you know Paul's letters were written before the Gospels? Isn't that interesting?
No.
Yeah, it is. That's an important point when it comes to the study of the historical Jesus. Now, skeptics have pointed out the fact that the Pauline epistles have zero references to biographical details about the life of Jesus, other than the death and resurrection. Like Paul never mentions Mary or any of Jesus' other family members. Okay? He never mentions Bethlehem, never mentions Nazareth, doesn't even refer to even one of Jesus' parables, none of his sermons, none of his exorcisms, none of his healings, none of his miracles, any of that stuff. And that's just kind of weird. And skeptics use this to argue that Jesus possibly was a legendary figure, if not an entirely fictional one. However, believers counter those arguments with the fact that Paul's actually not writing historical books, he's writing letters. And they were to explain theology, not to teach facts about Jesus, facts that the recipients of the letters may have already known. I say might because, well, the Gospels telling the story about Jesus were not written yet. But that doesn't mean news about Jesus wasn't spreading far and wide. Okay, so there are the 4 letters that Paul is said to have written to individuals, right? These are often called the pastoral epistles. Now, out of these 4, only one is universally accepted as being genuinely from Paul, and that is Philemon. Philemon very much matches the style of the 6 letters. And so that brings a total of 7 genuine Pauline epistles, widely accepted as without a doubt, hands down, was written by Paul. It's a toss-up of about 50% of scholars who actually believe that the other 3 pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are pseudopigrapha, which would put their time of their origin way later. Next up, we have Hebrews. And there's pretty much no biblical scholar today that credits this one to Paul. Not even the most conservative of scholarship circles. This letter begins with no greeting like Paul does, no sender with the first word Paul in the beginning, no recipient at the beginning of the letter, and at the end it says those from Italy says their greetings. But the book is called Hebrews, really because it was thought to have been sent to Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. So this book earns its place in more of an anonymous category. Now, there's been a hypothesis that Priscilla wrote this one, which if it is true, it does make sense that her name would be anonymous only because the Bible was written entirely by men. Although it has been rumored some female authors contributed towards the Tanakh or the Old Testament in some of the parts that are anonymous writings. Now, that's just a hypothesis. There is no way an established fact. It's just something that's kicked around amongst scholars. What we really know for sure is, in fact, that Hebrews is written in a very polished Greek and is the most carefully crafted and eloquent book in the entire New Testament, which makes it very hard to put a date on it. So I'll just say the standard ranges of estimate is between 70 and 100 CE. Okay, all right. So next up we have the 7 general epistles. First of which is attributed to someone named James, often thought to be James, the brother of Jesus, and the initial leader of the church in Jerusalem. Now, but we do know that there are many Jameses. James is actually one of the books that almost didn't make the cut into the New Testament because of this and some other reasons. Okay, most scholars feel that this is another piece of pseudopigrapha, either written by someone pretending to be James, the brother of Jesus, or by some lesser James who happened to be a person named James. Same thing with 1st and 2nd Peter, were probably not written by Peter. Even in those 2, based on style, are written in 2 completely different styles between 1st Peter and 2nd Peter. Now, 2nd Peter likely copied heavily from Jude. Now, some argument against Peter's writings is a pretty safe assumption that Peter was an illiterate fisherman. Now, others say that Peter could have learned to read and write later on, or could have used a secretary. But Peter's writing skills are not the only problem with these texts. You see, the letters just simply don't come across as someone who knew Jesus personally, which Peter did. They come across as someone who has a very highly academic and expert level knowledge of the Septuagint and other ancient writings. Okay? All right, so next up we have the 3 letters of John. It is tradition that these are from the same person who wrote the Gospel of John. But unlike all the other epistles except for Hebrews, these 3 don't actually start with the name of the sender. Now 2 and 3 do, but they start with the words the elder. Okay, as I've said in a previous cast, the Apostle John probably didn't write the Gospel of John. However, it is very likely that whoever did write the Gospel of John also wrote the 3 epistles of John. And here we have with these writings, the styles are close enough to assume one author for all 4 of them, simply based on the writing style. So highly likely someone from the hypothetical Johannine community is probably the ones that author these. Last up, briefly mentioned, is the Epistle of Jude. Now in this one, it says the text itself is to be the brother of James, which traditionally would mean that Jude was also the brother of Jesus. Just like the Epistle of James, the Epistle of Jude was one of those books that almost didn't make the cut. So the wide assumption today is that it's probably pseudopigrapha, meaning to that most scholars, none of the general epistles are genuine letters from the people who have said to have written them. This is quite different from the 7 Pauline epistles, which are in fact genuine. Even the most scrutinizing of scholars admit that these were written by Paul. So all of the general epistles are assumed to be written late in the 1st century or early 2nd century. Now, just how I talked about Thomas before when talking about the Gospels, because the time is so similar, I want to talk about a letter that came very close to making the cut, and that was included for actual some time before it was removed, and that is the Epistle of Barnabas. How many people have actually heard of it or read it? Okay, it was included in the canon for a while. For those who remember, Barnabas was a traveling companion of Paul, and as you probably guessed, the genuine Epistle of Barnabas was probably very likely not written by Barnabas. It is just another example of pseudopigrapha, just like James and Jude. But it was eventually dropped, as was the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache. Now those weren't epistles, but I thought they were worth mentioning. The Shepherd of Hermas is comprised of a bunch of visions, commandments, and proverbs, whereas the Didache is kind of like an early catechism church manual of sorts, which is kind of a summary, okay, that of Christian doctrine that was used for teaching. Now, why did some pseudopigrapha make it into the New Testament, but this one didn't? I don't quite know, and it seems uncertain according to my research so far, but for the first few centuries, it was indeed included with the other books. What decisions were made to not remove these ones, I have not found, but it's just interesting. Okay, so that wraps up another round of Bible history. Pretty soon we will be going back further into the Old Testament and get into some trouble there, right? Turn over some historical rocks and see what crawls out. Okay, well, hope that blesses you. Hope that educates you. Take care.